Reflexes are kind of automatic responses that occur without conscious control. So you may be able to think of one, for example, the patellar or knee-jerk reflex. So this is a kick that your leg does. The doctor checks this typically at your annual wellness check that I hope you get. And this is to make sure that we'll talk more about exactly what this measures. It's going to be the femoral nerve is one key component of it. But this happens without your control, right? You can stop it from happening if you really try, but you don't have to think about that kick for it to happen. At least I hope you're not. If you are kicking on purpose at the doctor's office, please stop so that he or she can measure that response that is occurring without your conscious thought, which is the purpose. So in this series of videos, I'll be talking about first giving you an overview of reflexes. We'll actually look at the knee-jerk reflex generally as an example of a reflex, the components that make up a reflex. Then we'll talk about the different types of reflexes, different kind of categories. And then we'll look at the knee-jerk reflex in more detail with more anatomy. And then we'll look at a few other types of reflexes. So withdrawal is a type of reflex when you touch something hot and you quickly pull away. You don't have to think about that. And then some crossed extensor. So the idea that both sides of your body, for example, you step on a sharp nail, you put your weight onto the other side very quickly to compensate to get off of that weight. That's a crossed extensor reflex. Okay, so let's start with I'm actually going to put up the learning outcome to start with this time. So what I'd like you to be able to do here is be able to see this. Describe a reflex response in terms of the major structural and functional components of a reflex arc. So a reflex arc, it's going to be similar to that response pathway that you've seen before. Let's put me down here. These components are listed here already. So stimulus, receptor, integration center, integrator, effector, response. Could you put those into here? And while you're at it, go ahead and put sensory neuron and motor neuron as well. This is the nervous system's response here. This is not going to be an endocrine pathway. That's too darn slow for a reflex. So go ahead and see if you can label these boxes as well as where the motor neuron and sensory neuron are located. Okay, hopefully you got something like this. You may have put these names in the boxes. That's fine. I'm going to put something else in there in a moment. Stimulus, receptor, integrator, effector, response. You're going to have an input here that is going to be your sensory neuron. This is also called the input signal, if you remember that term from your reflex pathway. This is the same as a reflex pathway, but I'm sorry, as a feedback loop, but this is not going to feed back. Oh, this is glitchy here. There we go. There's no feedback here. Instead, it's just a response. So for example, it might be a knee jerk, a kick. Let's get this edit here. I think actually I have this show up in a little bit here. Motor neuron. So if you were to try to put in the components of a knee jerk reflex, could you try to do that? Pause the video and try to put in what you know about the biology of the knee-jerk reflex. If you don't know it yet, that's fine. I'm going to go over it here as well as in detail in a later video. So here are those components. Oh, now I have those pop up, of course. Hammer on the knee is the stimulus. There are receptors. We'll look more at what these are called later. They detect the stretch. They're within the muscle, the quadricep muscle. This information is carried via a sensory neuron to the spinal cord. The spinal cord is the integrator of this reflex, which is why there's no conscious control of this needed. This is not going to the brain. This is just going to the spinal cord. The spinal cord is an integrator. You learned that in the last videos. That's going to then target the muscles, specifically in this case, the quadricep muscles that are going to contract. I actually should have that here. Contract, which is going to allow the knee to kick. Let's just type that in here. So contract is what the muscles are going to do to allow the knee to kick. So this is your reflex pathway here. The next thing I want to do is categorize different types of reflexes. We can actually categorize this one. It's a spinal reflex. How else do I want to categorize this right now? I actually don't want to do more than that right now. Let's look at this on a different image. There are different number of synapses that can occur with a reflex. Monosynaptic, what does that mean? That means one synapse. That is what's shown right here. Monosynaptic means two neurons involved. Two neurons means one synapse. Okay. There also can be polysynaptic reflexes. That's going to be where there's an interneuron as well, or more than one interneuron. Any number of interneurons is going to be poly is more than one. So that's going to be another way we categorize reflexes. The other ways that we categorize reflexes, I want to use these pictures here to diagram. These pictures have the same components I showed you in that previous simple diagram I drew out. Here's a little bit of anatomy incorporated in here, anatomy that you should know actually. So where is this cell body located? This is going to be in the dorsal root ganglion or posterior root ganglion. Because there's a collection of these cell bodies there. So some other ways we can categorize this reflex, both of these reflexes that are shown here, because besides the fact that there's more than one synapse happening with this bottom one, they are very similar in other ways. So they're both spinal reflexes, meaning that integration occurs in the spinal cord. Integration could also occur in the brain. That would be a cranial reflex. We won't see a whole lot of those, but they do exist as well. You also can have, this is a somatic reflex. What does that mean? That means it's controlling skeletal muscle and it is received, the information is received from skeletal muscle. We'll talk about what's the other category here. Autonomic. Those are going to control like the viscera. So the pupillary reflex, pupil dilation is an example of that. Heart rate reflexes. We'll talk about some of those later. Let's do here versus cranial. And we've also got this reflex is ipsilateral. Hopefully that word you've heard before, ipsilateral. What does that mean? That means it is happening all on one side of the body. The information is not crossing to the opposite side. That crossed extensor reflex that I mentioned already, that's going to involve contralateral exchange. So that would look like if this information travels to the opposite side, try to draw this here, a neuron, for example, would travel across this way. So we'll see that later. Contra would mean the other side. That's a synapse there, as you can obviously tell. Ipsilateral, same side. Knee-jerk reflex is an example. The knee that's hit by the hammer, that same leg kicks. Lastly, we've got intrinsic or innate reflexes versus learned or acquired. That will actually not be a huge focus, but there's some reflexes that you actually are born with and some that need to be kind of learned throughout life. It's an important part of like behavioral psychology to think about acquired or learned reflexes.